Welcome back to Expert Talks. I am Lauren Heindel, your host, and today we're diving into a critical topic for anyone in the wine industry, bridging the gap between winemaking and accounting teams. This episode is for winemakers, accountants, anyone who is on a cross-functional team, and winery owners alike. So essentially, if you are navigating the world where financials meet fermentation, this episode is for you. Today, we have Rachel Smith, who is the owner and operator of Northwest Wine Accounting, and she is an expert in all things winery accounting. Welcome, Rachel. We're so happy to have you.
Hi, Lauren. Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Awesome. Well, just a quick disclaimer. I always like to say this. This should not be taken as legal or tax advice. This is purely from the perspective of Rachel Smith and her professional experience. Also, just wanted to mention, if you want to connect with her more, we'll link her information and she's on the punch down. So you could do that after this. This topic, like I mentioned, is super valuable for any winemaker and accountant who work cross-functionally, and winery owners who want a better idea of who should really own what within their organization. So on that note, Rachel, can you begin by telling me who does what and what are the specific roles that a winemaker and accountant should own?
Yeah, sure. So just to jump into it, we're going to be talking about cost accounting here. And so when a winemaker is working with their accountant, specifically on the cost accounting, there are certain pieces of information that only the winemaker has that the accountant can't get just through the receipts and the financials and the numbers. And that's because the cost accounting specifically has to do with units and volume and things that don't come through normal accounting measures. So the winemaker has key information that the accounting team needs, and there has to be a way to figure out how to get those gallons and those units and the cases and all those numbers to the accountant so that the cost accounting can get done.
That is extremely helpful insight. And thanks for kind of shedding light on what makes sense from the winemaking side and the accounting side. So now I'm curious, what is the specific information that your accountant would need?
Yeah, sure. So whether you're working with an in-house accountant or an outsourced winery service or an accounting service like ours, we can just kind of go through the list of the kind of questions that they should be asking. And if your accountant isn't getting these things from you, you might wonder why they're not asking. And so it's really all the inflows and the outflows of both your bulk and your bottled wine. And so when it comes to bulk wine, those inflows are going to be how many gallons did you produce each year? That's the key thing. Your accountant doesn't necessarily know how many tons of grapes you bring in, but they need to know the gallons because that's the thing that we're costing and we're going to put a unit cost on. Another way you might get bulk wine in your into your winery is if you're buying wine. They're going to need to know how many gallons you buy because we got to figure out that unit cost. And then on the bulk wine side, it's all those outflows. So you're going to need to know how many gallons of wine you bottle, how many cases that ends up being. You're going to have to know how many gallons you sold, bond to bond transferred out of your winery. And then you're also going to need any unusual losses of bulk wine. And so what we're talking about here is big losses, the kind that you might file an insurance claim for, not necessarily every single standard little loss when racking and all normal operations. Like you will get an end of year inventory count, which is super helpful to square up all those things. You definitely need to have those inventory accounts so that you can see what wine came in, what wine left, and what you have at the beginning of the period and what you have at the end of the period. And that has to be calculated for bulk wine, and then it has to be calculated for your bottled wine as well. And so the bottled wine is all the cases that are bottled. If you bought shiners, the number of shiners that you bought, and then your accountant needs to know the numbers on the depletions, essentially how much wine walked out the door, whether that's through sales or for samples, wine that was sold by the glass, tasting pours, family use, and then any breakage, damage, any loss. And again, you're just trying to square up that occasion where your wine that comes in, your wine that leaves, and you should have a beginning number and an ending number. And so the winemaker has all those units, and then the accountant can come in and put the dollars on that whole flow of things.
Yeah.
And so you might notice that some of this information is really similar to what you report on the 5120 or TB form at the end of the year. They need to know all that flow as well. And so sometimes your accountant can go directly to that form to get the juice flow information that they need to calculate your cost of goods produced if they don't have a greater detailed level of information from you.
Okay, great. That's really helpful. And that's all pretty high level information. So does that really give the accountant like enough information to calculate the cost of each wine? Like if you're thinking rosé versus premium red versus white, because those are all such different products that you would make.
Yeah, exactly. So your accountant isn't there working in the winery, and if you're not giving them
Yeah.
the information to do that, all they can get is those high level average costs. And those high
Okay.
level average costs are going to be good enough for tax reporting, they're going to be good enough for your financial statements. But when it comes to making operational decisions, you really need more specific information than that. And what we found is we've started working with InnoVint. A platform like that is so key in getting the specific information where you can actually get your cost down to the specific lot and SKU and not just have this average cost of goods sold.
Amazing. Love the InnoVint plug there. That's really, one of our
It's
main things is to help accountants and winemakers work together. And speaking of InnoVint, what is the information that the winemaker is entering? Or what is the information the accountant is entering? Could you kind of explain that within the system?
Yeah, so we've been going through that with a lot of our new wineries that we've brought on this year that are using InnoVint. And so the exact separation of duties is going to depend on your specific situation. And it might depend on whether your accountant is in-house or whether they're an outsourced service like ours. But okay, so the winemaker, of course, is going to enter all the operational information. You don't want your accountant doing your work orders and all those things in there. The winemaker does that. And then there's the costing module where you want the cost accountant to come in and put the costs in there. But you have your direct costs and then you have your overhead and your indirect costs. And we have found in many situations that it works great to have the winemaker putting all the direct costs in because they know which costs go with which lot. So as they're bringing in grapes, they've got that grape invoice in front of them or the weight ticket or whatever it is. If they've got that dollar number, like just have them put it in the field.
Oh, yeah.
Other direct costs like bottling supplies, glass, corks, capsules, labels, the additives, what you guys call dry goods and any of that stuff. If the winemaker is entering the units that they purchase, there's a field there for dollars and they can just put the dollar in. The thing you have to remember is that InnoVint's not an accounting system, and so you don't enter things by invoice, and you might have to split up invoices, or there might be shipping charges or pallet charges, and there's all these little nuances of other like just pieces of dollars and cents that you can't really expect the winemaker to account for. And so you got to have your accounting professional going in there afterwards and seeing what the winemaker put in, and hopefully they'll get there like 90%, but then the accountant can come in and say like, well, we actually had all of these costs in QuickBooks, they got to go in somewhere, so let's get it to a specific lot, or let's just put it in the overhead pool or the other pool and allocate it across everything, because in the end you really want InnoVint to match QuickBooks. You don't want to be putting more costs into InnoVint that are in, and I say QuickBooks, not everyone is using that, but if you're using QuickBooks,
Yeah.
you also don't want the opposite where you're putting all these costs into QuickBooks and they're not getting into InnoVint, because then you've undercosted your wine. And so really you got to find that line where the winemaker's putting in whatever they can directly, but that the accounting team is coming in after them and squaring it up after all.
Okay. Okay. So thinking along the lines of, who does what, identifying these roles, when we're talking about overhead, is it the accountant's job to really figure out what goes into that and what the overhead costs are for your winemaking? Yeah, you would say?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to overhead, that's where we're really getting back into the accountant's territory, because the accountant can advise on, well, what do we really want to capitalize? We want to get the full cost, the true cost of your wine in there. So let's figure out what, let's put in the cost of your facilities, the depreciation on your equipment and barrels, the winemaker's labor, all those things. And so the accountant can help identify what should go in there, but it's often hard to actually see in QuickBooks, like, is this production related? Is this not production related? And so we sit down with all our new wineries when we're getting their cost accounting set up, and we go through the P&L and we repair and maintenance, small tools and equipment, like rent, like interest, do we want to call these production related or do we not? Because you really have to understand the winemaker's books to understand what they want to say is production related and what is not. And then we can set up some rules. So we have that month after month. So we always know, okay, this is production related, we're going to capitalize it, this is not. But in the beginning, it's important to sit down and get the accounting team and the winemaking team together and figure out what we're going to capitalize and then what not. And then the accountant can just kind of own that and get that overhead applied each month after that.
Yeah, it sounds like deciding on a plan and sticking to that plan is like the name of the game when it comes to overhead costs. Would you say that there's like a general like rule of thumb when deciding what goes to overhead costs and what doesn't, or not so much? It depends on each winery.
You generally want to just make sure that everything that is production related is going to get capitalized into the cost of your wine. And then you get into some complicated areas here, because that's your best practice for GAAP or for, book cost accounting to get that true cost of your wine, which is what you want to be making your managerial decisions on. For tax purposes, you don't have to capitalize every last one of those things. And so then you get into this complicated territory of book to tax adjustments, and you're going to have your book cost and your tax cost. But we really advise wineries to get their full book cost and get that calculated, because that's really only when you know what your true margins are, is if you get everything included, all your overhead capitalized, and then adjust it back to what's your best optimal tax situation. And your accounting team and your tax accountant should be able to help you do those things. But it definitely gets a little bit complicated. So
yeah, it sounds like You have to like make a decision and then stick with that as you keep going further and further down the line.
Yeah,
But
and consistency is important too. I mean, it really is,
yes, yeah.
especially with tax. I mean, if you decide you want to change the way you're accounting things in your books, if you're like, we haven't been doing this right and we need to get our books cleaned up, like that's one thing, but you want to really think about it when you're changing things for tax. So,
Mhm, mhm. Well, great. You previously mentioned the importance of cost accounting and how that's really what we're talking about here. And could you give us your expert advice on how often it should be done and why?
yeah. So, how often? A lot of wineries only get their cost accounting really calculated at the end of the year because their tax accountant is the one doing it. And so you'll just be doing your bookkeeping, putting your costs in your books, and it's only in April, or maybe if you're on extension, September or October of the following year, that you'll get this mysterious journal entry that you put in your books. It's like, here's your cost of goods sold. And so we really, that's like the minimum, like you should get it done for tax time. And so year end, that's super important. But we really think that you need to get it done more often if you want to use that information to make good decisions. And so you definitely at least need to do it when you bottle, because what we're talking about here is the bottled cost. And so when you bottle, you want to know what your cost is. So pricing decisions, and so you can look at the margins and all of that. But what we really recommend is that you just get a system going where it's running perpetually, and every month it's reconciled to the books. And so that every month you're capitalizing all your costs to the balance sheet, and then every month you're getting the cost of goods onto your books and you're reconciling it to InnoVint or to whatever costing worksheet you're using. And it's important to realize that your cost of goods sold is not something that you can get to just through bookkeeping, just coding your transactions, reconciling your bank accounts. You have to do all those things, but it's not going to get you to that calculation. It's something that has to actually be calculated either in Excel or in a system like InnoVint. And then when you figure it out, you have to get that cost of goods sold, the unit cost, multiply it by your depletions, and then enter that number into your book. So it has to be handled it's not a bookkeeping task, it's really an accounting task that has to happen on top of your bookkeeping. And so, yeah, hopefully that gives you a better idea of some of the complexity and why we really recommend doing it monthly.
Over once a year. And I mean, I can only imagine it would help reduce errors and help you make better decisions,
Yes.
every quarter based on how you're tracking, say like a wine goes awry or you have higher inputs than you expected, you can kind of make adjustments as you go versus waiting
Yeah.
until you get the final number.
Plus you can just pure memory, you can remember what you're doing. I mean, people who only file
Yeah.
a TTB form once a year, it's like, scratching your head and going back through your notebooks and trying to figure it out. And our winery compliance specialist, he puts actually everyone on a quarterly cycle for those reports, just so
Nice.
he doesn't have to go so long and they're like, I don't know what happened last February, so that he has better tabs on it. So yeah.
That's smart. Yeah, I don't know what happened last February either. Well, that's a really great recommendation. So, say I'm a winery owner and I have a winemaker and an accountant. What are the deliverables I should be expecting from them and when?
Yeah. So what do you really get out of this complicated mess of wine accounting? So the most important thing is you should get your bottled cost. So you should know what it costs to make each bottle. And ideally you should have that by SKU and you should have it at bottling time. And even better, if you're doing planning and production planning, you should be able to project what that cost will be so you can budget and plan for your sales strategy and your production strategy ahead of time. So the bottle cost is the number one thing. And then once you get that bottled cost, of course, that's what allows you to calculate your cost of goods sold, which is that key line on your financials, and not until you get your cost of goods sold. So that's your unit cost times your depletions. Then you can see your margins. And ideally, the other deliverable you're going to get from this whole process is your margins by channel. So if you're tracking things down to that detail, you should be able to see your margins on different sales channels. For instance, margins on wine sold through the tasting room or the wine club or your distributor, direct to retail, so that you can see the different profitability of different channels so that you can make those decisions about when you need to change course with your overall business strategy. And there's other things you can get from it. If you get accurate wine costing, you'll have accurate work in progress and finished goods numbers on your balance sheet. And a lot of wineries get a line of credit based on their inventory. And so they have to have that figured out. Or if you're getting a business valuation, you want an accurate accounting of your finished goods and your work in progress. And then another thing that you can see is this thing that we call your cash flow from inventory. And so this is what I mean by that is it's how much cash that you're investing in building up your inventory, or if you're in a wind down stage with your winery, how much cash you're generating by selling inventory that you already have. And so wineries know that like profit can be very different than cash flow. And this is really one of those key things. There's other areas where they can differ, but definitely investing in inventory is a thing that catches a lot of people by surprise. So if you're working with a qualified cost accountant, you should be able to see how much you're spending each year to invest in inventory that's not even showing up on your profit and loss. And that's a real key thing for planning. Yeah, Yeah,
That's
I
great.
mean,
Yeah.
yeah, it's just so many things. It's like you can't really work with your financials unless you get your costing in place, like doing break-even analyses or what, you can look at your overhead expenses, your operating expenses. I mean, not your overhead for production, but your overhead for operating your winery and be like, well, what do we need to sell to cover our expenses, to cover our labor and our selling costs and all those things. And so if you don't know your margins, if you don't have good cost accounting, it's really hard to figure those things out. So
So this is such helpful information. Let's take it a step further. Now, what resources would you say are available to help fill in the gaps for winemakers or accountants who may feel like they need extra support, or if some of this jargon was maybe over their heads and they want, or maybe they just want a refresher on some of this stuff?
yeah. Yeah. So I know it's complicated. I mean, it just is complicated. So we generally don't recommend that winemakers or winery owners go it alone when it comes to this. You want to make sure you have a tax professional who specializes in wineries. That's pretty important. Having InnoVint is a great resource, but of course, that's not alone going to make this all happen. It's a good first step. But then working with an accounting firm that specializes in wineries, and that's what we do. And there's other ones out there that can be a really smart move. Or if you have an in-house accountant, you want to make sure they get the adequate training and support so that they know these things. There's some colleges out there that offer courses. We send our staff to costing courses at Sonoma State University online, for instance, and that's been a really great resource for us.
Awesome. I'm a Sonoma State alumni, so love
Oh,
that.
wow. Perfect.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Rachel, for your expertise on this subject. And if you want folks to reach out to you, if they have more questions about this topic, how could they contact you?
So our website is northwestwineaccounting.com, all spelled out. And you can email me at the same domain name. It's Rachel at northwestwineaccounting.com. And I'm also on LinkedIn and on the Punchdown.
Great. Well, that's a wrap for another episode of Expert Talks on the Punchdown. We encourage you to keep the conversation going in the comments below and share this episode with a colleague that you think would benefit from this information. Until next time, thank you.